Okay, so I've got a talk here. It's based on something I wrote just recently, called "Living Kinship and the Love of Science." So it's about kinship, and I suppose at this time of crisis that we're all going through at the moment, we're remembering that we owe our life in the world to our kinship with others, and also that this kinship is not something that is simply given. It's not something that we just carry around with us, that was implanted in us at the moment that we were conceived or born, that this kinship has continually to be performed. We have to do it. And we perform kinship in all sorts of little acts of nurturance and care, of looking after people, talking to people, giving things to people. And these acts are carried on in the shared experience of overlapping generations. And I think one of the most upsetting aspects of the current crisis is that our possibilities to perform these acts of care have been very radically curtailed, not been able to meet people, hug people, and so on in the way that we're used to. And that this loss is felt in the hearts, not only of those who would be the recipients of our care, but they're felt in our own hearts as well. So I want to start by presenting an imaginary example of what performing kinship really means. So what I mean by saying that kinship is something that we have to perform in every moment of our lives. And I've often thought that there's no better place to observe human kinship than on a sandy beach in summertime during holidays, because there you can actually watch it going on. You can watch it in real time as it is said and done in all the little ways in which groups of people of all ages, from the tiniest infants to the most wizened elders, gather in little groups, in little knots or clusters, encircling themselves with windbreaks and parasols, or simply by drawing a line with a finger through the sand. So you see the group of people arriving at the beach, and they set up with their towels and their rugs and their portable furniture. They draw a little circle around themselves, and then they carry on and saying, now we're going to enjoy ourselves on the beach. This involves a good deal of sometimes raucous vocal communication, in which words of endearment, astonishment, and command are mixed up with shouts and squeals, laughter and tears, all against the background, of course, of screaming seagulls, barking dogs, and the reassuring wash of the waves. And then, if it's a nice warm day, as the many layers of clothing worn in ordinary life are stripped off to be replaced by swimwear, or perhaps for the youngest children, nothing at all except a sat, there's a certain intimacy of bodily contact. For example, watch people anointing lotions and sunscreen on one another, or the rough and tumble of children's games. But then, once people have established their arrangement and shared their provisions, then they scatter every which way to comb the beach, look into pools, jostle waves, so that the little knots of people you see begin to unravel. And we see people just dotted all over the place in a scene of apparent chaos. And yet, barring disaster, at the end of the day, all these different bodies will come back to base. The groups will reform. People will come back into their little knots. So the question, then what is it that brings all these people back together? What ties them up? Well, that something is kinship. So the question is, what is mysterious force that seems to tie people in knots almost despite themselves? But as you sit there watching what's going on the beach, you have the impression that what holds people together in little groups is not a matter of choice. That's to say that for each and every participant, the others are simply there. Older ones have always been there until they eventually pass away. And younger ones have arrived not from the outside, but born into the midst of everyone else. And yet, thrown together in life, these people are fated to muddle along as best as they can. Now, of course, physically, individuals come and go, and the knots of little knots, groups of people that actually form on a beach can be of the most varied composition. But even with those who, for whatever reason, are not physically present, their presence is still felt, it still lingers. They're there in conversation or in memory. So let me make up a purely imaginary example so that you can see what I mean. Let's suppose in our example, we see two brothers, about 10 and 12 years old, and we watch them rollicking around on the beach. They also remember their dad, who left their mother a couple of years ago and only sees them rarely now. And they now have to put up with a stepfather who arrived through no choice of their own, and a half-sister born just 3 years ago. But they dearly love their mum, and they like their little sister, and who's the daughter of the new husband, and would do anything to protect them. But the real rock of the family is Granny, the mother's mother, who never scolds and is a source of endless kindness, although she's still grieving from the recent loss of her husband, the children's grandpa. And then there's their uncle, their mother's brother, who's still a bachelor, and then the boys are not quite sure about him. He's just come along for the day because he always does, but they don't quite know what to make of him. He's just a relative, but he gives them presents, and their mother tells him that they should write thank you letters. So we've got a little imaginary family here. Two brothers, aged 10 and 12, their mum, their stepdad, their half-sister, who's the daughter of their mum and the stepdad, and their mother's mother, the granny, and the mother's brother, their uncle. And there they all are sitting on the beach, a little cluster of kin. Now, this is an entirely imaginary, though very realistic example, but it does illustrate the messiness of human kinship with all its complex and unstable passions, and yet grounded in a sense of presence from which it is no more possible to escape than it is from one's own existence. The boy's mother and their uncle once grew up together as brother and sister, and they might have alternately adored and detested each other. But the memories from that time, which might perhaps have included seaside holidays, are still seared in their hearts, profoundly affecting their sensibilities and the ways they act and respond towards others. Now, let's say in another 20 years or so, the two brothers, who are now little boys, aged 10 and 12, and we see arguing and fighting with one another and laughing the next moment, those two brothers will likely have gone their separate ways, perhaps living in separate places with families of their own. So they will eventually become distant. But that distance between those two brothers will never erase the closeness of their common childhood. So much is shared by siblings growing up together. They share not just days out by the sea, they share the attention of parents, they share the environment of the home, they share the commensality of meal times, of eating together. And of course, this is a very important thing nowadays, they even share the infections and immunities that build up as a result of growing up together. You know, even just holding hands in a family can mean that people, very close relatives who are together, are actually sharing the same biological infections, the same antibodies, the same immunities. So that there's a family resemblance in a way that is often evident to everybody except perhaps themselves. And the last people to see the resemblance is the siblings themselves, and everybody else can see it. And in a way, the tragedy of kinship is that similarity repels and that closeness inevitably breeds division. It's the brothers' very intimacy in childhood that will eventually drive them apart. But then in that repulsion lies kinship's hope that the siblings, having gone their separate ways, will eventually bind themselves together in other knots. So, repelled by similarity, lives are brought together and find their continuation in difference. And yet no one lives together. No one lives forever. And that's why the loss of a kinsperson, however distant they might have grown in life, is always a cause for grief, because it's the loss of part of oneself as well. Now, if I just return to this little imaginary gathering of kinspeople on the beach. Remember the two brothers, their half-sister, mum, stepdad, granny, they're on the beach. There's one participant in this little kinship group that I've failed to mention. I'm referring, of course, to the family dog. Now, the dog is loved by all. She's a constant companion. Wherever the others go, she goes too. And in her own way, the dog is as vocal as the others, makes just as much noise. People talk to the dog and the dog responds. And the dog, like people, always looks forward to these days on the beach. Not only because there's the freedom to run around, it's a change from being stuck at home all day. But if human families tend sometimes to be a little wary of strangers, dogs are far more sociable. And if you go, at least in Britain here, if you go to the beach, there are always usually about as many dogs as there are people. And these dogs are having a wonderful time because they're meeting one another and exchanging it. And even if they haven't met before. So if human families are a little wary of strangers, the dogs never miss an opportunity to meet up with other dogs of their own kind. And the general hubbub of these canine encounters can initially induce a degree of consternation among the dog's human handlers, who are rather keen to, in public, to assert their control, but then it can often spark off friendly conversation between people who might otherwise pass by without even talking to one another. But then after every encounter, the dogs are called away by their respective handlers to where they belong in the human fold. So it means that the dog is as much caught up as everyone else in the traffic of affection and disaffection that we see played out on the beach. In the family, the dog and possibly her offspring share with human generations the experience of growing older together. Surely kinship is produced and reproduced in this experience. So then you ask, well, does that mean that the dog is actually a kinsperson? The dog's been sharing this experience of everybody along with everybody else, so why is the dog not a kin? And well, many would say, yes, well, it is more or less a kinsperson, except for one thing. And that one thing is that the dog lacks human progenitors. It doesn't have human parents. At the end of the day, however affectionate the bond between them may be, between dogs and humans, dogs are descended from and humans are descended from humans. And that, many people would say, rules out the possibility of any real kinship between humans and dogs, even though they've been growing older together, living in the same family, talk to one another, recognize one another, love one another. Despite all that, people would say, no, dogs and humans can't really be kin because dogs don't have human parentage. Now, this invocation of dissent at once introduces another logic of kinship, which is very much at odds with observations up to now. And not everyone subscribes to it. Indeed, if you were to compare ideas of kinship from people around the world, it might turn out to be more the exception than the rule. But it is a logic that holds particular sway in Western societies. And these are societies in the grip of a way of thinking, nominally scientific, although not all scientists would adhere to it, a way of thinking which seeks truth in universals, in laws that apply to things regardless of time, place, and context. Now, applied to living things, this is the claim that every living being is determined in its essential nature, independently and in advance of its life in the world, by a complex of attributes bestowed upon it at the very moment of conception. Just at that moment when a living being, the life of a living being is inaugurated, it already has a set of attributes in place. Or in a word, these attributes are said to be inherited. And the thing about inheritance, so say when you inherit property, the thing is when you inherit a piece of property, it is passed on ready-made as it is. And by the same token, the attributes a living being is supposed to inherit from its ancestors are passed on ready-made. So that life is given over to their expression or fulfillment, but not to their production. Now, nowadays, following the popularization of microbiology in the middle of the 20th century, it's become common to refer to these inherited or heritable attributes as genes, even to say, oh, they're in the person's DNA. You get the DNA arrives at the point when you are conceived in the womb, and along with the DNA come all these inherited attributes, and then you've got them from the start. So what happens during your life is merely that these are expressed, written out, but they're not produced in life. So according to this logic, the measure of kinship is to be found in degrees of genetic connection or relatedness given at the start, rather than in any relationships that are formed in early or later life. So the more closely related two individuals are, the more inherited attributes they share in common. So then the web of kinship in this logic is not woven from the threads of life as they're gathered in the kinds of knots that we see being tied on the beach. The web of kinship is rather formed of the connections between procreative events, each of which marks the point of inauguration of a new life cycle. And that's what we mean when people, or that's what is meant when people say that real kinship is biological. Keep getting this thing. What's a person's real father? What's a real biological father or biological whatever? It's the one who has passed on the DNA. So when people say that real kinship is biological, their understanding of biology has got nothing whatever to do with the life of organisms, or even of the study of the life of organisms. I mean, biology is really the name for a branch of study. Biology means the study of living organisms. But nowadays, if somebody says, oh, real kinship is biological, or that this or that attribute is biological, they're not talking about a branch of study, they're talking about an attribute, and they're saying that that attribute has been given a priori, it's there right from the start, and is unaffected by anything that might happen to its carrier during their lifetime. So biology has come to refer to these inherited attributes. And because they're things that are there, or attributes that are there from the start, biology then excludes all those acts through which parents nourish and care for their children. It excludes the sharing of infection and the build-up of immunity that I was talking about earlier. It even excludes the contribution that a mother makes to the growth of her child during pregnancy. Instead, biology has come to mean a program, literally a biologos, allegedly pre-installed within every living being and orchestrating its growth and its behavior from the inside. So then everything else is taken to be but an expression of this a priori genetic logos. Now, naturally, there are situations in which such a direct genetic connection cannot be traced. So, for example, in the imaginary example I presented to you earlier, there were two brothers and their half-sister. The half-sister who was the child of the brother's mother and the new husband, the brother's stepdad. Well, now, although this half-sister, this little girl, is very much a part of the brothers' present lives, genetically, she's a stranger. Sorry, and I'm getting mixed up here. The father of this daughter is genetically a stranger. But this is taken then as the exception that proves the rule that the boy's real biological father is another man altogether, with whom they now have little contact. Now, with their mother, it's different, because she has loved each of her sons from long before birth, ever since the first quickening in her womb told her that a child was on the way. As soon as she has a sense, a child is growing in me, then she's begun to love that child. But the thing is that this love, this maternal love that develops even before the child is born, owes absolutely nothing to the coincidental fact of her genetic contribution to the embryo. It owes everything to the intimacy with which that new emerging life is folded within the compass of her being. It really it wouldn't make any difference whether the unborn embryo had got its genes from the actual mother, or perhaps in some cases a surrogacy from some other person. It makes no difference, because what underpins the love of the mother for the child is everything that is going on as that embryo is growing within the mother's womb. And yet the calculus of kinship as genetic connection has no place for love or care or nourishment or any of the other affections that allow life to flourish. It's supposed, according to this logic, that these affections are purely derivative, that they're the expression of evolved instincts which owe their establishment to impersonal forces of selection. It's the genes, say people who take this view, it's the genes that make us who we are. And how many times have you heard this said by scientists and others, that it's the genes that make us, and all the rest is just expression. Now, by and large, on this matter of kinship, mainstream bioscience has marched to much the same tune as popular belief, each feeding on the other in a spiral of mutual reinforcement. And interestingly, this is true of the way we imagine kinship, not just within species, such as our own, but also between one species and others. Among individuals of the same species, the preferential treatment of kin is allegedly encoded in the language of inherited genes, which competing for a stake in future generations, gain an advantage from causing their hosts to behave in ways that improve the life chances of fellow carriers. So the closer, the logic is like this. This is the foundation of sociobiology, that the closer the connection genetically between any two individuals, the greater the proportion of genes they will have in common, and so the higher the payoff from helping, assisting that other being who shares your genes. So you can even work it out mathematically, that you would jump into the water and save some people drowning. It will pay off for the reproduction of your genes if you jumped into the water to save at least 2 siblings, 4 half siblings, 8 first cousins, 16 half first cousins, and so on. Now this might work for insects, but applying this theory to creatures as complex as humans leads to conclusions that can only be described as farcical. I mean, are we seriously expected to believe that should these children, in our imaginary example, should these children run into trouble while bathing in the sea, would the boys instinctively help one another before going off to help their more distantly related half-sister? That's what the theory would tell us. Say, well, brothers know they're genetically more closely connected, so they better look after oneself first and then worry about their half-sister. So not only does the theory offer a grotesque caricature of relations that in real life are haunted by multiple and often conflicting feelings, the reasoning is also entirely circular, because taken on their own, genes do not encode for anything. There is no reading of an organism's genes that is not part of the process of its development, richly structured and varied environment. And for human beings, as for creatures of many other kinds, this environment includes others whose presence and activity helps to shape their developing dispositions and sentiments. So kinship, as I tried to show from our observations on the beach in this imaginary example, kinship is fashioned in the shared experience of generations growing older together. And to suppose that this play merely follows a script that is already written in the language of the genes is simply to put the cart before the horse, as we say. And in modern evolutionary theory, this kind of circularity is endemic. And it afflicts the way we tend to think of relations between species as much as of relations within them. Up to now, I've just been talking about relations among humans. But what if we look at relations between the human species and other species? The question arises, are we innately disposed to favor creatures to which we have the closest genetic connection? Now, among extant creatures, these ones to which we have the closest genetic connection are the great apes, particularly chimpanzees. Well, we might like to think of chimpanzees as long-lost relatives, but our human record of helping them is not particularly great. They have, on the contrary, been driven close to extermination. And most of us have seen them only in pictures, or if they're alive at all, may be caged in a zoo. However, when the primatologist Jane Goodall, after years of habituating a band of forest-dwelling chimpanzees, I think in Tanzania, to her presence, she eventually shook an old chimpanzee whom she called Greybeard. She eventually shook him by the hand. The popular press went wild, and they said this was the handshake that spanned 5 million years. because it was 5 million years ago that the common ancestors of chimpanzees and humans are supposed to have diverged. So when Jane Goodall shook old greybeard by the hand, she was building a bridge over this 5 million years of divergence. So then you think, well, how many million years do, when you watch these children playing on the beach with their dog, you think, how many million years do the children span every time they caress the family dog? It would be maybe more like 30 or 40 million years, but who cares? Because for them, the question is entirely irrelevant, because the phylogenetic connection between humans and dogs has absolutely no bearing on the feeling they have for the animal as a lifelong and faithful companion. Or more generally, an understanding of our kinship with other species on the basis of genetic proximity or degrees of relatedness is bought at the expense of cutting every being out from the matrix of relationships in which it lives and grows, and then treating each as an isolate attributed to its class. Oopsies, oh dear.
Tim, are you still there? Okay.
Scusate, abbiamo perso il professor Ingold, ma stiamo cercando di rincontattarlo per capire in quale parte del web sia andato a finire.
Yes, I think he's trying to reconnect. Now,
Just, okay, yeah. I'm sorry the connection broke. It's a bit unreliable, this Google Chrome connection, and I think when there's so much pressure on it, it has a habit of breaking. And I'm not quite sure where I broke off.
Well, you were speaking about the Jane Goodall and the kinship.
So you got that far. Okay. Yeah. So then, so I'll maybe just pick up again and recapitulate that bit so that people will get it. So I was talking about the primatologist Jane Goodall, who had been living with these chimpanzees, eventually shook an old chimpanzee that she'd called Greybeard by the hand, and the press called it the handshake that spanned 5 million years. And then I was saying, well, what would happen? How many million years do you span every time you stroke your dog? So with the implication that when we understand our kinship with other species on the basis of genetic proximity or degrees of relatedness, it's at the expense of cutting out every being from the matrix of relationships in which it lives and grows, and then treating each as an isolate attributed to its class on the basis of covert attributes encoded in advance of its entry into any real world environment. And that is not the way to restore human beings to the continuum of the living world. And I think the problem, the fundamental problem, lies in the logic of descent and inheritance. Remember that we say dogs can only be descended from dogs and humans only from humans. But not everybody in the world would agree. Many people, as we know from anthropological studies, many people around the world number among their ancestors mountains, creeks, hills, birds, bears, and all sorts of mythical creatures. We would understand the ancestors not as a source or conduit for inherited attributes passed down the line from generation to generation, but as beings that came into the world before them, or whose presence belongs to time immemorial, and that through the active manifestations of that presence shaped the conditions of life for those living since. So my ancestors are people who shaped the world that I've come into, not people from whom I've had handed down a set of attributes. So in that sense, the ancestors are their stories, and it's the role of descendants to carry these stories on. And likewise, as people and animals go through life together, they become part of each other's stories. And as lives overlap, so they're carried on or relayed from generation to generation. So in this understanding, the one I'm trying to put forward, kinship is fashioned in the relaying of lives, rather than set down in advance in the inheritance of attributes. It is, if you will, the work of memory, of bringing stories of past lives into present experience in forging the relations of the future. Kinship is the memory of others lodged deep within ourselves, and the memory of ourselves lodged in the others. So that means that our kinship with the earth and its creatures has nothing to do with sensibilities that have come down to us as part of an evolved legacy. There are a lot of rather new agey people who are saying that we ought to recognize our kinship with the animals and our kinship with everything else because it's something that was installed into us when we were hunter-gatherers and we've inherited as part of our human nature. It's nothing to do with that. It's not to do with some sort of hunter-gatherer way of being that we ought to get back to and that is somehow deep down in our evolved nature. We won't find it as a genetic endowment inherited from ancient hunter-gatherers, nor even is it necessarily tinged with positive affect. I mean, with non-human, as with human kin, we can love them or loathe them, often at the same time. But what we cannot do is escape them. Because my argument is that kinship is not the product of an evolutionary process, but the very matrix of relations in the unfolding of which life itself evolves. And as such, it's the very condition of our existence in a relational world. So finally then, what do we do with science? I've shown how particularly scientific attitude to kinship reduces it to a logic of genetic connection. But does that mean if we have to, it doesn't mean that we have to reject science itself. Maybe we could have a different kind of science, a science that's not a scientific study of kinship, but a way of doing science that could itself be a practice of kinship. Could we care for things and nourish them? Could we give back to them what we owe for our own existence in the world by studying them? Could we think of science as a form of studying things, and that study is itself a practice of care through which we perform our kinship with them. Well, that means acknowledging that science itself, as a way of knowing, is grounded in our relations with other beings and with the world. Because it is, after all, the world that has brought us forth. We wouldn't exist without it. Now, as it stands at the moment, science goes to great lengths to deny our kinship with the world, to sever our connections with it. It's a condition of objectivity, that we hold ourselves apart from whatever we study and have nothing directly, nothing personally to do with it. And the result of all that disconnect is, of course, our present ecological crisis. But I don't want to argue against science per se, but I do want to argue that we can do better science by recognizing our way of knowing the world as part of our way of being in it, and of grounding science then in the performance of our real kinship with the earth. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry about the technical hitch.
Thank you, Tim. I don't know if Professor Campanini want to say something. Shall we just, I don't know.
Oh, no, thanks. It was very, very interesting. It was a subject very actual and very interesting, but I leave to you the conduzione del dibattito.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ingold.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So is there any question? Well, okay, maybe I will jump in and break the ice. So thank you, it was really a fascinating and extremely timely topic, especially in Italy, where we had this strange situation until a few weeks ago, where basically we were allowed to get out with only certain kind of people, supposedly our relatives, until the 6th degree of kinship, which is was a little bit strange. And so it's very, very, I think, timely. So maybe just I think your talk is pretty striking for people like me who has studied anthropology as a basic discipline. No, my formation is in anthropology, and I remember all the graphs and the diagrams of the kinship are quite really are quite something. And yeah, so I wonder how my approach to anthropology would have been different if I would have read this kind of like a paper like that. So, but I have one question because it seems that in your talk somehow there is a kind of dualism that you may want to clarify, because it looks like that on the one hand, and I'm pretty sure that is not like that, but this can be something that you may want to clarify. So on the one hand, we have nature, so natural kind of kinship, which is decided by our genetic degree of proximity. And on the other hand, there is the cultural kinship, which is what you explained with the lively and beautiful example of the beach. So this is my question: how can we overcome that dualism? That knowing your work, I guess, is not what you want to. What are you arguing for this kind of difference? So this is my first question.
Okay. It's very difficult because it's not really a distinction between the natural and the cultural, but it is between a geneticist and a relational view, and the difficulty is that taking a relational view enables you to overcome some of the dichotomies that the geneticists come up with. For example, they would make a distinction between genetic and cultural inheritance, and say that, well, there are the genes you inherit, and there's also the traditional culture you inherit, and a lot of them are now writing about what they call dual inheritance models, in which there are two tracks of inheritance, a genetic one and a cultural one. And from a relational point of view, we can say, no, this is nonsense. There's no, because it's not inheritance, it's a question of growth, and growth goes on in an environment, and you can't say that it's natural or cultural. But in that very process of demolishing or deconstructing the dichotomous thinking of science, you end up creating another dichotomy between the scientific model and the relational model. Yeah. And then you think, what do we do now? And one response would simply be to say, well, we'll take one side and forget the other. So we'll just be relational and forget about the science. But what I want to do is to turn it the other way around and say, well, no, let's not forget about the science. But instead of grounding our relational understandings on the foundation of a decontextualizing science, let's turn it the other way around and ground our science in a poetic acknowledgement of our relational involvement in the world. Let's do a science that can itself be a way of dwelling. And I don't think that that's so far from the experience of people who actually do science, people, real committed scientists who love what they study and love their work, would understand that quite implicitly. The trouble is that they've been taught and trained to say that they're not allowed to express it. They're not allowed to acknowledge their love for what they study. And I believe that we would do better and richer science if we allowed that acknowledgement rather than trying to suppress it.
Yeah. This reminds me a lot of we had this year a talk by Andreas Weber that you may know, and his point, was about biology. He makes an interesting point, saying that biology is so focused on genes and this kind of model, and basically has forgot about life as it unfolds in the real world. So biology is not actually the studying of life, but as becoming something else. So this is something.
Absolutely. Yes. And when I've discussed this with biologists, often it turns out to be the problem turns out to be that the biologists want to model things. They want to construct predictive models of a quasi-mathematical kind. And they say, well, it's all very well, your relational approach. We like it, we understand it, we appreciate it, but I can't build any models with it. And that's the difficulty.
Absolutely. Any other question?
There's somebody.
There is Philip.
Philip Linanda.
Hello.
Hello. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, here we go. Video. This should work.
Now I can see you too. Okay, hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for the speech. I have. I thought it was quite difficult to follow. I mean, it was complicated stuff with kinship and how everything is connected. So I wrote down my question in text, and I will just read it so I'm clear.
Okay.
So in your approach, then, science would be about creating new ways to benefit future relationships, to live better together in the future. And maybe we would do a different kind of science about dogs, let's say, if we would study them like that, like how to make new memories for our future human-dogs interactions. And maybe we would focus less on like veterinary stuff and what would happen if we would take this science and discuss about birch trees. Maybe we would focus on nice things like how to enrich our lives with using kinds of sap, or instead of focusing on chemistry. So I just want to ask if you think this approach kind of fits very well into this slow food arc of taste project with the device where we use it to save it and we benefit all.
Well, let's start with the slow food and work back, because if you think, what does the word slow really mean in an expression like slow food or slow all sorts of other things? It doesn't really have anything particularly to do with speed or how quickly you do something. It's really about paying attention to things. And sometimes to pay attention to things, you have to move quite quickly. So it's not about the speed. It's about aligning one's own attention to that which one is studying and grounding one's observations in that very close perceptual coupling between you as an observer and the thing being observed. So you and the birch tree, or you and the dog, or whatever it is. And this it's an approach that actually goes back to Goethe. And now people talk about Goethean science, and mainstream science thinks Goethean science is ridiculous. But what Goethe said we should do, if you want to study a plant, say, if we're a botanist and we're interested in a particular plant, then we should spend hours and hours and days with that plant, watching it, seeing how it behaves through the day, and when the sun goes in and the sun comes out, and when the rain falls and when the rain doesn't fall. So you really feel that plant has got right inside you, and you can feel it almost intuitively. And then, having got that intuitive understanding of the plant, having almost become a plant yourself, so that you can see what it's doing with plant-like eyes, then you make your scientific observations. And Goethe's idea was that if you do that, you will notice all sorts of things that a standard scientific, objective, methodological approach would not notice at all. It wouldn't notice it because in the standard approach, you cut those relationships so that things are just not observable. And we know as anthropologists too that we talk about the knowledge of indigenous people, which is often very rich and very subtle. And it's in just that respect that indigenous people seem to know so much more about, say, the animals that they work with than a scientist ever does, because it's grounded in this very deep intuition. So what I'm suggesting is that we revalue the intuitive. I mean, in our standard discourse, intuition has a very bad press. We're supposed to be intellectuals, not intuiting things, and it's regarded, intuition is regarded as somehow second-rate, derivative, subjective, and the rest of it. What I'm suggesting is that we do a science that turns this the other way up, and that really grounds our. I mean, all science depends on observation, and we want to allow the things we study to tell us how to observe, and that's the really critical thing. When we allow what we study to actually guide our own observations, then we'll see things and notice things that we don't notice otherwise. And out of that, can grow a knowledge of a sort of conviviality and sort of knowledge that will enable us to carry on our lives together.
Thank you.
I hope that answered the question.
Yes, that was great. Thank you.
Well, maybe I have a Well, I have several other questions, but I will go just with another question, which has to do with with what Philip raised with the problem of yeah, let's say with the word slow. So thinking about the particular moment that we are living now, I had the strong feeling that really science, the so-called science, has been really enslaved to a neoliberal model, and so it has to rush to produce certain results. And of course, it looks to me that this kind of political system, it doesn't really work with somehow with your proposal, no?
No.
With the idea of, so yeah, what do you think about that? So this is the,
No, it doesn't work, and that's the trouble, that science has allowed itself to be hijacked by the global knowledge industry, by the neoliberal model of knowledge production. And it hasn't really put up much resistance. I mean, that's to say, I feel very ambivalent about science, because on the one hand, you know, scientists are nice people and they care they care about the world and everything just as much as the rest of us. But science as an institution has allowed itself to become hijacked by corporate industry. It hasn't put up any significant resistance, and I think this probably goes back a long way. I mean, when I was a student in the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a big movement about responsibility in science. I remember joining a committee for the social responsibility in science, because there was a feeling then that scientists had simply sold themselves to the military, which was, you know, doing terrible things in Vietnam. And so it's a problem that goes back a long way. But there's a sense in which we have to rescue science from itself. And we, meaning particularly people in the social sciences and the humanities in particular, we've got a very, very important job to do. But it's a very difficult one, and the only way to do it seems to be to know where your friends are. That is, that among all the scientists, there are quite a few who actually would be very sympathetic to everything that you or I would say, who are feeling very frustrated and sometimes angry. We need to, rather than demonizing science and scientists, we need to find where our friends are and work with them to try and chip away at it. But it's a huge job.
absolutely, yeah. But I guess this is our job now. It looks very, very important.
It's a job now. After all, nobody in the world has the power to stop the economy, to stop everything. But this bloody virus does, and it has. And the only positive spin you can put on it is that it's actually at the point where we were being driven over a cliff edge. And before this all broke out, everybody was either saying, oh, we just go on with the neoliberal thing, it'll be great, or they're saying we're all doomed. There was no other possibility. And now we do have a moment to step back and think, and it's already happening now in little ways. I mean, that it's revolutionizing transport. Everybody, the vast majority of people in this country are saying they will never go back to the volume of air traffic that happened before. It's not that it will gradually get back. We'll never go back there. And we are going to stop driving our cars everywhere. And we're going to have people cycling and walking all over our cities. I mean, this is happening already now. And it's amazing. So there are possibilities. We shouldn't be too pessimistic about it.
there are, I think, 2 questions. Eva, if you want.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I'll turn up my camera, then you can see who is talking to you. Wait a second.
Ah, there we are.
Yeah.
I can see you.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very nice to hear too, and I also related a lot to it because I'm an only child and I don't have a lot of literally kins around me, but I got raised in a sort of a communal home with a lot of people, so I have this very strong connection with people that I grow up with, but there's no genetics, no real connection there. And I had a question. Do you have the idea that we are decreasing this feeling of kinship in general in the world population, or is it just becoming really selective to a sort of a bubble that we are in? I don't know. Sometimes, yeah.
In this immediate condition that we're in, I mean, everybody has been forced to contract into the particular groups in which they found themselves. But that's a very unusual, peculiar situation, and we can hope it won't last too long. That normally, no, I don't think kinship has diminished at all. I mean, one of the myths that we often teach anthropology students when they first start, and when they do a course on kinship, because it's very central to anthropology, they're told something like this: in Western societies, we don't value kinship very much anymore. It's all economics and politics. But when we go to study other societies around the world, and non-industrial societies, non-Western societies, why there kinship is the very basis of everything, and that's why kinship is so important to anthropology. That's the message that's put around to students, but it's a very, very misleading message, because after a while you discover that actually kinship is every bit as important for us as it is for anybody else. It's that the idea that somehow in Western societies, affluent metropolitan societies, kinship doesn't kind of matter like it does for other societies, or is I think completely untrue. But maybe we keep telling ourselves that it doesn't matter, that it's not so important, even though we know in our bones that it is. And one of the things that this crisis we have now, I think, has really revealed is just how important for people it is. And they might not have really recognized it or articulated it before, and now they're really feeling it. I mean, because there are things that they used to take for granted. That grandparents could meet up with their grandchildren whenever they felt like it, and now they can't. And in the old days, maybe they wouldn't have said much about it because it was just obvious. That's what they did. But when you suddenly find a situation, as I find myself now, we can only meet our grandchildren on the Skype, and it's heartbreaking. And because you want to give them a hug, and you want to be there with them and everything, you really, really feel it in here, and that, I think, is the same for everybody. And perhaps one of the good things that this is bringing out is that people are just becoming kinder, actually, in the sense that they're beginning to recognize the value of many kinds of human connection that before they're taken for granted.
Yes.
I hope so. We try to find positive things to say in the circumstances, and it's so grim otherwise that you have to. I mean, they say that the UK is the most anxious country of all, and the reason is that we've been fed. I mean, the press has done nothing but hype things up and get everybody as terrified as possible. I'm not quite sure why, but it's awful the way it's been done.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but in Italy it happened the same, basically. Really the same. Yeah, we are terrified by the press, actually. Yeah.
Yes, it's the press that's terrifying us. That and statistics. So endless statistics.
Yes. Zuber, do you have a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Hello?
Oh, now I can see you. Hello. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. And I was just wondering about this idea of kinship in terms of the major and minor. I've been reading your book, Anthropology as Education, and it's actually just really helped me through this time of isolation. And so I was just wondering about kinship as like a volitional habit, or sorry, a volitional or habitual thing, and if the situation has the power or potential to transform kinship as something we do in a more habitual, intentional way. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that does make a kind of sense, and because the thing is that I talked about performing kinship, but the two terms that I used in that book are doing and undergoing, and those doing and undergoing are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is performing. So when we perform kinship, we are in a sense doing it, but we're undergoing it as well. So what we do is also something that is happening to us, and it's therefore transformative. And in the book, I was drawing a lot on the philosophy of John Dewey, and Dewey was looking at the relationship between doing and undergoing, and arguing that we have to put the doing inside the undergoing. That's to say that when you do something, you're always transformed, meaning that the next thing you do, you're already taking into that next doing the transformation that resulted from the previous one. So that there's always from whatever you do, there's always a sort of overspill into the world and into your relations with others. And that's why your life is not just a series of disconnected episodes, but actually an unfolding movement. And I like the idea of habit, because we can say also that habits are things we do, but also things that we undergo. The thing about habit is we're not in front of them or behind them, but in the middle of them, and so it's quite a useful concept to think of kinship as you could almost. I didn't really think of this, but you could think of kinship as a kind of habitual practice in that sense. Habitual, not in the sense of just doing stuff automatically without thinking, but in the sense of inhabiting one's own practice, so that it becomes one's own practice becomes a way of dwelling in the world, inhabiting the world. Now I think it would fit very well, and largely in terms of the minor in that scheme is minor rather than major. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good things to think about.
There is another question, Khalid. Khalid? Yes.
Good evening, Professor.
Hello.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just had a quick question. You mentioned that kinship can have different social and biological explanations, but what about within anthropology? Like, for example, do cultural and social anthropologists, do they agree when it comes to kinship, or do they have different views on kinship?
Oh, there are certainly differences. There are differences in anthropology about everything, but there has been a shift in anthropology over the last 20 years or so, maybe something like that, from the classical approach that Paolo mentioned at the start in his remarks, the sort of thing that both he and I were trained in when we did our degrees in anthropology, where there were all sorts of kinship diagrams and kinship charts, and you'd put people with lines linking up people into genealogical connections, and they, when approaches to kinship are very in anthropology are very much more relational. So in the old-fashioned idea, you would talk about descent, for example. If just to take a simple example of how you would describe a relationship between a parent and a child, let's say a father and a son, just for example, and in a traditional, I don't know if I can do a diagram on this system, but traditionally, I don't know whether you can see that at all, but here's one triangle, and here's another triangle, and here's a line. Can you see that? Maybe you can. Two triangles and a line.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
That's the father-son. Here's the father, here's the son, and this line shows the son is descended from the father. Now that way of looking at things means that you're putting each individual, the father here, the son there, in a little spot, in a little triangle. So that here's this one, here's this individual, and the line itself is a line of descent. Let's say it's a connection between two individuals that are specified quite independently of that connection. And so that was that sort of assumption was built into the anthropology of the time. And for that reason, there were endless debates, which didn't get anywhere, about what is the relationship between biological and social kinship. And this is what, in the 1960s, this was what anthropologists disagreed about. Some argued that ultimately all kinship was biological, meaning it was all based on genetic connection, and that there might be some social divergences from that, but there were exceptions. And others argued that social kinship is separate from biological kinship. But they were still thinking of kinship in that same way in terms of connections between individuals. And the thing that happened, sort of brought in partly through feminism in the late 1980s and 1990s, was the feminist scholars who are really pushing for an approach that started off with relations and started off by showing how actually people grow each other through the way they relate to one another. So that's a later approach in anthropology. There's still arguments between traditionalists and relational people, and you never ever get any consensus in anthropology. But there has been quite a significant move, I would say, in anthropology towards a relational way of thinking, which supposes that the field of human relations is relational in itself. That relations come prior to the people that emerge in, and that's pretty well established now in anthropology. I hope that was clear. It's very difficult to answer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Paolo? I know.
Yes. Is there another question from somebody else? I don't know. Otherwise,
No.
yeah, okay. Well, I will take advantage because we haven't spoke for a long time, so I will ask you another question.
Indeed, it's nice to talk to you again.
Again. So, and this has to do precisely with the idea of performing kinship. Like 2 days ago, we had a talk with Nicola. The role of the body in the question of physical and this physical and social distancing. So these kind of questions. And so my point was that somehow the social is always performed, and as such, it somehow it requires the body. Even though, I mean, of course, the body can be read in a lot of different ways. So it's not just our shell; it can also be something else. So I wonder about the, let's say, the kinship at the time of the coronavirus. No? If how this idea of performing kinship can be, if can be performed and understood in a different way, and not just with the physical presence of our physical bodies. So this is my confused question. It has to do with the idea of performing.
Well, first of all, I think that mostly in ordinary circumstances we perform with our bodies, as you say, and we wouldn't be able to perform very much without them. It doesn't mean that what we're doing is embodied. That's another thing. It's not embodied, but it's a bodily practice. But here we are. I mean, I'm working my arms about and being pretty much of a body here. You're being pretty much of a body there, and the difference between that and us being in the same room having an ordinary conversation is that it's being mediated by all this technology, which I don't understand at all. But I wouldn't want to say that there's really a qualitative difference. I mean, there's the same thing. The same argument comes up when people have discussions about virtual reality and argue that there are people who say that, you know, that if everything is, if our contact is mediated by, then we're actually interacting in a virtual space rather than a real one. You know, that you're just this head that's on a photograph, and I'm just a head on a photograph, and there's this thing that's going on in a completely way that is completely detached from our respective bodies. And I just think that's completely wrong, and that a lot of the rhetoric around the notion of virtual reality is very misleading in that respect. I mean, you could simply go back to the days when the telephone was first invented, and people thought, this is amazing. I can talk to somebody who's far away and hear their voice. And maybe they thought at the time that this is sort of something quite different from what we're accustomed to. And yet nowadays, if we simply look back on an ordinary telephone conversation, well, oh, that's just a telephone conversation. Now we have virtual reality. But what's the difference between the kind of communication technology we have now and the communication technology that was when the telegraph was first invented? It's just different. It's just different wires, different media, different channels of communication. But it's still you and me. And that's, I think, the way I tend to think of it. That there's not such. This is still a very bodily thing that's going on here. No less bodily, actually, than if we were talking together in one room. You know what? I noticed it bodily. One of the effects, I found this before doing a lecture on of this kind, and I was sitting on my chair as I am now, in front of the screen. I was booming away with this lecture, and I finished, and then a few seconds after the lecture, I thought I was going to faint because somehow all the blood pumped into my head away from my feet because of the posture. Because normally you're standing up when you're doing this kind of thing. When you're sitting down, I suddenly thought, ooh, I had to hold on to my head. And I just noticed that feeling beginning to come back now. And I thought, I've got to be careful, because you realize it's definitely a body.
Yeah, it is.
Anyway, are we done? Is anybody else?
No. Is there any other question? Eva.
Yeah, sorry. I have one more question.
Oh, you're welcome.
I was thinking in this time that we could all maybe need, or you could use a little bit more of kinship, especially maybe not even towards other humans, but maybe also more to animals and plants in general. Would there also be a way to sort of provoke the development of kinship towards something, someone, or entity?
Yeah, we're really simply talking about care. I mean, the kinship is a word in which we're simply wrapping up into this idea of kinship, an orientation to other beings in the world, which is one of care and attention. So it's I suppose it's an ethical stance towards others, so we're simply wrapping that ethical stance up under the umbrella of this word kinship. And so the way to establish our kinship with other beings in the world is simply to pay attention to them and care for them. But then it gets a little problematic, because as I mentioned with kinship, it doesn't necessarily, the kinship doesn't always carry positive affect. I mean, there are a part of caring for others is sometimes you or even loving others, you sometimes loathe them as well. that you're recognizing that you're existing in a world together with these other beings, that your own existence depends on being in this world, and the same goes for those other beings. It doesn't mean, and you shouldn't get, I don't think one should get too romantic or rosy-eyed about it. It doesn't mean that sometimes the world does not treat you kindly, or that you might sometimes treat the world unkindly. Even that can be part of a way of a form of kinship. So it's one thing to say that you're caring for things, that you're part of the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything's just lovely. You can't do that. I don't think we can engineer a world in which everything is sweetness and light. But we can engineer a world perhaps in which life can carry on in some sense, rather than being brought to a primitive conclusion. Something like that. I don't know. I can't answer any better than that. It's a difficult question.
Thank you so much.
Well, maybe we can stop here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was really nice. It was a very fascinating talk, and it was nice to see you.
Indeed, and you too. Yes. So I hope you're keeping well, and you're fine. And pass my regards to Simone. And one day, as they romantically tell us, even the Queen was on the television saying, "We'll meet again." One day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
My regards to Anna.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.